Yivarekeka Adonai V'yishmareka.
We'll be talking about the Song of Solomon today, and this is just an introduction, is all I'm able to do in these 2 hours, is just kind of introduce the Song of Solomon. And I'm going to pull one verse to begin with out of chapter 4 and verse 1 through 5. And here you have the bridegroom speaking to the bride. And listen to what he says here. He says, "Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes." Isn't that sweet? "Within your locks, your hair is as a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn, which came up from the washing, whereof everyone bare twins, and none is barren among them. Your lips are like a thread of scarlet. Your speech is comely. Your temples are like a piece of pomegranate within your locks. Your neck is like the tower of David, builded for an armory, whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. Your two breasts are like two young roes that are twins feeding among the lilies." So you want to know what she looks like? I'll show you what she looks like. Oop. There she is. Her hair is like a flock of goats. Honey is dripping from her tongue. So there's the Song of Solomon illustrated. Doesn't she look gorgeous? Now, what you're going to find is I see the Song of Solomon differently than a lot of people. One of the things that we need to realize is I want you to think of the Song of Solomon as a play with a cast of characters. Now, if you're looking at your notes, here are some of the characters that are in this play. You have the King Solomon, but you also have a shepherd, okay? That's not King Solomon. You have the Shulamite. She is the bride, so to speak, here. And then you have her family. You also have the daughters of Jerusalem. And you also have this entourage that follows Solomon wherever he goes. But now, here is the plot. I want you to think of the Song of Solomon as a play, and here's the plot of the play. King Solomon is enticing the Shulamite with all that the world has to offer, yet the Shulamite is being pulled away with cords of love by a shepherd who would be king. What this is, it's a prophetic story about the Messiah wooing his bride to fulfill her calling and being one with him and working the harvest together. If you remember in 1 Samuel 8, Israel said, "We want a king like all the other nations have." And God was very upset. Samuel was very upset. And God said to Samuel, "It's not you they've rejected, but they've rejected me, that I should reign over them." And so instead of having God as their king, they wanted a human earthly king. What the Song of Solomon is about is God pulling his bride away from the concept of an earthly king who wants to dominate and be over them to him who is their shepherd king. You following me? And so when we read this, what we're really going to be looking at in one sense, I want you to see it as she's trying to escape from King Solomon. Think of it as she's trapped in the castle, so to speak, with King Solomon, and she's trying to escape. That's how I want you to view this. So let's take a look at the Song of Solomon. One of the things that's the key to understanding this book is knowing who is doing the talking. And here's how you know who is talking. She always refers to him as my beloved. For example, in Song of Solomon chapter 5 verse 4, she says, "My beloved put in his hand by the hole of the door, and my bowels were moved for him." Okay, so we see my beloved refers to him. Does everyone get that? Whenever you see the term my beloved, she is talking about him. the shepherd, the Messiah. Okay? We're going to look at the Messiah as the shepherd. She is speaking, whenever she says my beloved, she's talking about the shepherd. The shepherd always refers to her as my love. For example, in Song of Solomon chapter 4, verse 1, he says, behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are like doves from behind your veil. Obviously, he is not going to be wearing a veil. She is. Okay? And he refers to her as my love. She refers to him as my beloved. That is so important that you understand that. So now look at Song of Solomon 2:10. It says, my beloved spoke and said to me. So who's speaking there? The Shulamite. And then, what does he say? He said, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. So who's speaking there? The shepherd. Do you see how easy this is? Now, the reason why this is important is because there's a mistranslation in the King James Version of the Bible that really messes this whole thing up that I want to correct. But when you understand the context and the concept of who is my beloved and who is my love, first off, does the Lord ever sleep or slumber? Who's the one that tends to fall asleep? The bride, the humans. Okay, so I just wanted to lay that foundation. Okay, the story is divided, actually, let's look at it in the terms of a play, into 6 different acts. How many of you know we are the ones who are double-minded? Oftentimes. This starts in chapter 1, verse 2, and goes all the way through chapter 2, verse 7. And you find out it ends with her falling asleep. Then, the second section, the shepherd now calls her to himself and to his work. And you're going to find this beginning in chapter 2, verse 8, going through chapter 3, verse 5. And what do we find happen? She falls asleep again. And then the third section, the Shulamite is out searching for her beloved. This is chapter 3, verse 6 through chapter 5, verse 2. And what happens? She falls asleep again. Okay, so who's the one that's constantly falling asleep? The bride. Then the fourth section is the Shulamite searches for her beloved again, and this time there's true repentance. The fifth section, the Shulamite now joins her beloved working the harvest. This is chapter 6, verse 11 through chapter 8, verse 4, and enters into true rest. And then lastly, the sixth act, the Shulamite enjoys full communion with the shepherd. This is chapter 8, verse 5 through chapter 8, verse 14, which speaks of sanctification or her being set apart to him. And so this whole book is really prophetic of God trying to get his body to get to work, but we keep falling asleep. We don't want to work the harvest. We just want to stay in the four walls of the church and be blessed by God. And then we fall asleep. And so it's a progression of the body of Messiah for the last several thousand years. Aren't you glad God is merciful to us? Now let me ask you this. About how many songs, this is the Song of Solomon, how many songs do you think Solomon wrote? The Bible tells you. Look at your next verse. 1 Kings 4:32. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs were 1,005. Okay, so he wrote an awful lot of songs. But now here's the most important part is you have to know the historical background. The one thing they say is, you know what we learn from history? Is that we don't learn from history. That is the one thing we've learned from history. So let's start and go with 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7. You can look it in your Bible. You can follow me on the notes. And let's look at historically where this is all coming from. Here's where the Lord had said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. Now, isn't that amazing? I don't know if you know this, but do you know what the Hebrew word for hear is? It's shema. And it literally means to hear and obey. You know how you tell your kids to dump the trash 2 or 3 or 4 times and they go, I heard you, I heard you? And you say, I don't want you to hear me. I want you to do it. Okay? So in Hebrew, they just have one word, shema. Hear and obey. Hear and do. But here you find God is telling Samuel to hear and do what the voice of the people are. Don't do what I say. Don't do what I want. Give them what they want. He says, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Can you imagine? They didn't want God to be their king. It says, according to all the works which they have done, since the day I brought them out of Egypt, even until this day, works with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. So oftentimes they think they're working for God. But these are not what God wants them to do. They're not his works. It's their works they're trying to do for him. Or other gods. And then he says, so they do also to you. And so he says, now I want you to listen to their voice. But can you imagine, how many of you have ever been offended by somebody? Or offended somebody? When you think about it, if you've been offended by someone, you know, I'm going to cut you off at the ankles, boy, you know. But look what God said. If anyone should be offended, God should hear. But look what God said. Talk about a humble God. He said, I want you to listen to their voice, but protest solemnly to them and show them the kind of king who's going to reign over them. Look at what he says the king is going to do, or the concept of an earthly king. He said, this will be the privilege of the king who will reign over you. He's going to take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots. And they're going to run before his chariots. And he will appoint commanders over thousands and commanders over 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and make his weapons of war and weapons for his chariots. And he is going to take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take your fields and your vineyards and olive yards, the best, and give them to his servants. Doesn't this sound like government? Okay? And he says, and he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and he's going to give it to his eunuchs and to his servants, and he's going to take your male slaves and your slave girls and your finest young men, and he's going to take your asses and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and you shall be his servants. And then what's going to happen? Now look at what that says. You are going to cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. And the Lord is not going to answer you in that day. And so here God warned them what's going to happen. But look what the people's response was to Samuel after God warned them. The people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, we will have a king over us, and we shall be also we like all the nations, so that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And so Samuel heard all the words of the people and repeated them in the ears of the Lord. So they wanted to be like all the nations. Now look at 1 Kings 9, verse 22. Solomon did not make any slaves out of the sons of Israel, but here's what he did do. They were men of war, and they were his servants and his rulers and his commanders and rulers of his chariots and his horsemen. And they were the chief of the officers who were over Solomon's work. It doesn't say God's work, it says Solomon's work. And you notice this very verse of all the things that he said that the king was going to do, that's what Solomon did. Now, the question is, what do you think the people thought of Solomon's rule? Okay, let's look at what the Bible says the people thought of his rule. In 1 Kings 12, if you remember, the kingdom, remember Solomon died. And then you have Rehoboam and Jeroboam, right? Rehoboam was Solomon's son. God went to Jeroboam and said, look, Solomon's been bad, and so I'm ripping Israel apart. And I'm going to, for David's sake, basically, after Solomon dies, I'm going to give 2 to his son Rehoboam, and you get 10 tribes. Okay? So anyway, Solomon dies now, and all the people are looking at Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is trying to keep the kingdom together. He's Solomon's son, and he wants everyone to rally around him and make him king. Listen to what the people tell Rehoboam about his dad, Solomon. This is going to tell you what they thought of his rule. And so here's the situation with these guys. are talking to him, and he says, Rehoboam says, well, what advice do you give that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us? So they're telling him that Solomon put on a heavy yoke. And the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him and saying, so shall you speak to this people who spoke to you, saying your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter for us. This is what you're to say to them. My little finger will be thicker than my father's loins. My father loaded you with a heavy yoke, and I will add to your yoke. My father has whipped you with whips, and I will chastise you with scorpions. So what is this telling you that Solomon did? Laid on a heavy yoke, whipped them with whips. This is what it's saying. Now look at 1 Kings chapter 5, and let's go to verse 12. Now we see here that the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, right? God gives gifts to men, and then what you do with that gift is up to you. You know, the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, God gives gifts to men, and it quotes the Psalms where he gives gifts to men. And they're good gifts. James says every good gift, every perfect gift is from heaven above. But how often do we take one of these gifts and we pervert it or we use it wrongly? And it says here, the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him. And there was a peace between Hiram and Solomon, and they two made a league together. The Hebrew word here is a brit. It's a covenant. And King Solomon raised a levy out of all of Israel, and the levy was 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month by courses. A month they were in Lebanon, 2 months they were at home. Adoniram was over the levy. And look at this. Solomon had 70,000 that bear burdens, 80,000 hewers in the mountains. Beside the chief of Solomon's officers, which over the work, there were 3,300 which ruled over the people that wrought in the work. And so he's got all these people laboring and doing this work. And he made a covenant with Hiram to help build the temple. But it's a brit. But I want you to look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. It says, when the Lord your God will bring you into the land where you go to possess it, and you've cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations are greater and mightier than you, and the Lord your God will deliver them from before you. You are to crush them, completely destroy them, and make no covenant with them, no show mercy to them. Don't make any brit. One of the first things Solomon did, he made a brit. And Deuteronomy says, don't do these things. Now let me ask you this. How many of you have ever worked for somebody and you did all the work, but they took all the credit? You know what I'm talking about? Maybe not you, maybe someone else was doing all the work. You know, you can get a leader of an organization or whatever, and they talk about what I did and what, you know, my organization does or something like that, and know there's thousands of people that are really doing all the work. When you look at Solomon's temple, let's look at 1 Chronicles 28, verse 11 through 19. David gave to his son Solomon the pattern. So David is the one who had the pattern. David gave to Solomon the pattern of the porch, of the houses, of the treasuries, of its upper rooms, of its innermost rooms, the place of the mercy seat, the pattern of all that he had by the Spirit, the courts of the house of the Lord, and all of the rooms all around the treasuries of the house of God, of the treasuries of the holy things. So who gave Solomon, who got the pattern by the Spirit of God? David did. So David is the one that got the pattern and gave it to Solomon. And let's go down to the bottom of the page there. Well, let's finish reading it, because I want you to get the idea of everything that David did for his son Solomon. It goes on to say, and for the division of the priests, the Levites, for all the work of the service of the house of the Lord. All the work, it says. For all the vessels of service in the house of the Lord, even gold by weight for things of gold. For all instruments of every kind of service, silver for all the vessels of silver by weight, for all the vessels every kind of service, by weight for the lampstands of gold, for their lamps of gold. I mean, just with the weight of each lampstand and its lamps, he gave the lampstands of silver by weight. I mean, just look at all this. And let's go down to the bottom line that I have underlined. It goes on to say then, All was in writing from the hand of the Lord, and he made me understand all the work of the pattern. So David got everything. Do you see that? And David gives it to his son Solomon. Everything, all the pattern. So now let's go to 1 Chronicles 29, and we're going to look at what David said. David the king said to all the congregation, Solomon, my son, whom alone God has chosen, is young and tender, and the work is great. So Solomon wasn't, he was an adult per se, but we don't know if he was 18, 19, 20 years old or something like that. And so look what David says. For the palace is not for man, but for the Lord God, and I have prepared with all my might for the house of my God. And look what David said. Not only did he give Solomon the pattern, it says David gave the gold for the things of gold, the silver for the things of silver, the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, wood for the things of wood, the onyx stones and the stones to be set. And he says in bold type I have here, in abundance. So who gave a whole lot of the silver and the gold and the bronze? David did. And then it says, and also, because I've delighted in the house of my God, out of my own treasure of gold and silver, I have given to the house of my God over and above all that I prepared for the holy house. Look at what he gave. 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of silver, the gold for the things of gold, the silver, for all kinds of work by the hands of skillful workers. And then he says, and who is willing to consecrate his service this day to the Lord. And everyone goes, yay, me too. And so it says here, the chiefs of the fathers, the rulers of the tribes of Israel, the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, with the rulers of the kings of the work, they offered willingly. So everyone's chipping in gold and silver. And they gave for the service of the house of God 5,000 talents of gold, all these, the talents of bronze and iron. And then in verse 16, I have it noted there. Let's look what it says. He says, O Lord our God, all of this store that we have prepared to build you a house for your holy name comes from your hand, and it's all your own. So even David and everyone gave everything that they had, the gold and the silver. They had the humility to acknowledge even what we're giving really comes from your hand anyway. Do you see the humility David has? He gave it in abundance, but he goes, God, it's really all yours anyway. And then in verse 19, he says, give to Solomon, my son, a perfect heart to keep your commandments, your testimonies, your statutes, and to do all these things, and to build the magnificent house for which I have made ready. So, who gave him the pattern? David. Who supplied most of the gold and the silver and bronze? David and the people. Okay? He has made it ready. Now, let me ask you something. If you were Solomon, you've got the gold, you got the silver, and now you become king. How soon are you going to want to start building the temple? Right? Wouldn't you think, hey, let's get going. We got the stuff. We got the pattern. Look at 1 Kings 6:1. It happened in the 480th year after the sons of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Okay? 4 years later, he decides to begin to build the house of the Lord. Now, something doesn't seem right with me on that. Now, look in the 1 Kings 6, 37, 38 of that chapter. It goes on to say, in the 4th year, in the month Ziph, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So here we see that it's right there in the 4th year. But look at 1 Kings 7:1. Well, let's finish 6, 7, 30, 37, and 38. It says, the last sentence, so he was 7 years in building it. So how long did it take to build the temple? Okay, well, let's look at 1 Kings 7:1. Solomon was 13 years building his own house. Maybe that's why he got a late start on building the temple. And he finished all of his house. Okay, the priority seemed to be, let's get my big mansion started. And then after we got it going, then we'll get the temple started. But also there was something else that was taking up his time. Let's look at 1 Kings 7:2. He built also the house of the forest of Lebanon. The length thereof was 100 cubits, the breadth thereof 50 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits, upon 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams upon the pillars. So he not only built his own house in Israel, he also went to Lebanon and built a big house. Oh, and by the way, in 1 Kings 7:8b, it says he also made a house for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken to wife. So I can understand why he had to put off building the temple of the Lord. He had to build his house in Israel, his house in Lebanon. He had to build one for Pharaoh's daughter. Now, look at Psalms 127, verse 1. This is David speaking to his son Solomon. And it says, a song of degrees for Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord keep the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. So David is telling Solomon who's supposed to build this house. Remember the Lord talked, the temple was called a house. You know, the house of the Lord is not to be a den of thieves. When you hear the word house, it's talking about the temple. And so he's saying, unless the Lord builds this house or this temple, you're going to labor in vain. Now that's going to make a lot of sense here in just a minute. It's going to have another layer of meaning to this. Let's look at 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. What does Solomon say here? This is his dedicatory prayer. He's dedicating the temple. And Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness, and I have built a house for you to live in. You remember hearing about all the thousands of people that participated in building this thing? And who does he say built it? I did. A place for your dwelling forever. Verse 18, but truly will God indeed dwell with men on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot continue. How much less this house which I have built? Let's go to verse 32 through 34 of the same prayer. And also to the stranger who is not of your people Israel, but has come from a far country for your great name's sake, and your mighty hand and your stretched out arm, if they come and pray in this house. See, the word house refers to the temple here. Then hear from heaven, from your dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calls to you for, so that all people of the earth may know your name and fear you as your people Israel. And also I want them all to know that this house which I have built is called by your name. And if your people go out to war against their enemies by the way that you should send them, and if they pray to you toward the city which you have chosen, and the house which I have built. Look at verse 38. He says, if they return to you with all their heart, with all their soul in the land of their captivity, where they have carried them captives, and if they pray toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, and toward the city which you have chosen, and toward the house which I have built. Look how often he's mentioning, trying to take the credit. And a lot of what he said was great prayer, and it's all good, but you see this underlying thing of him trying to get all the credit here. Now remember what David in Psalm said, unless the Lord build the house, they labor what? Look what Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 11. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit, and there's no profit under the sun. Right there. Exactly what David had warned him. You don't build the house, Solomon. The Lord's building the house. It's his gold. You're his servant. These people aren't your servant. Now look at 1 Chronicles chapter 17, verse 4 through 7. This is what God told David. He said, go and tell David, my servant, so says the Lord, you shall not build me a house to dwell in. For I have not dwelt in a house since the day that I brought up Israel, even today. I've gone from tent to tent, from one tabernacle to another. Wherever I have walked with all of Israel, did I ever speak a word to any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to do what? Feed my sheep. Does that ring a bell? 3 times, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. What are the leaders supposed to do? Feed the sheep. Okay, God really doesn't need it. I mean, when you saw the How Great Is Our God video, do you think God really is impressed with our little houses? Do you think he's going to dwell in our little houses? He says, I commanded you to feed my people. Did I ever say to any of them, why have you not built me a house of cedar? And now you shall say this to my servant David, so says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, so that you should be ruled over my people Israel. So God wants someone to rule over them who is a shepherd, not an autocratic, authoritative king to dominate and rule and control and manipulate you. Okay, that's what the Gentile leaders Jesus was saying about. All they want to do is control and manipulate you and lord over the flock. The leaders are supposed to be shepherds who feed the sheep, not fleece the sheep. So now let's take a closer look at Solomon. Now, Solomon, if you remember, just to get your time frame, I like to work with 500-year increments just to make it easy. I may be off a few years. But basically, Abraham was 2000 BC. Moses is 1500 BC. David is 1000 BC. So David is 500 years roughly after Moses. So they've had the Torah for 500 years. Okay? Now, for math's sake, we'll say 490 years. Now, every 7 years, the Torah was to be read to the entire congregation of Israel. Okay? So every 7 years, everyone is supposed to hear the Torah being read. Over 490 years. So if they heard the Torah, they've heard the Torah. Now, Solomon, who lived 400 to 500 years after the Torah was given by Moses, Israel then was very familiar with its instructions, especially when it came to a king. As the Torah was very specific concerning a king, and by Solomon's time, Israel had already gone through 2 kings, actually 3, but you have Saul, and you have David, and now it's Solomon's turn. Look what Deuteronomy 17, verse 14 and 15 says. It says, when you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you shall possess it, and you shall live in it, and you say, we want a king like all the nations have. Now, this is 500 years before, guys. He says, you're going to set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, and you shall set a king over you from among your brothers. You may not set a stranger over you who is not your brother. So, first off, they had to make sure that he was Jewish. Okay, an Israeli, so to speak. They couldn't have someone from the other nations be voted in as their king. Now, this is what is a real kicker. Look at what Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18 through 20 says. And it'll be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he has to write his own copy of the Torah in a book. So that means Solomon was supposed to sit down and write from Genesis through Deuteronomy, handwrite his own copy. He couldn't have a scribe write it for him. He had to handwrite his own copy. Now, why do you think God wanted the king, whoever it may be, to write his own copy of the Torah? How many of you want your leaders thinking they're above the law? Is there supposed to be one set of rules for senators and congressmen and a different one for us? Okay. So God says, look, I want the king to write a copy of this law in a book from before the priests and the Levites. So the priests and the Levites were looking over to make sure he didn't make any changes. And the purpose of this is so that the king may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this Torah and these statutes and to do them. And here's the reason why. So that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. In other words, I'm better than you. I mean, supposedly our governmental leaders are supposed to be our servant, but they're really our rulers taking dominion over us, typically. But God says, I don't want them to lord over the flock. I don't want them to have the heart that's lifted above their brethren. And that he does not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he may make his days longer in his kingdom, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. Now let's take a look at what Solomon was supposed to have not only read, but wrote in his Torah scroll, what God commanded concerning the king. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 16, it says, the king is not to multiply horses to himself. And in 1 Kings 4:26, we see Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses. Gee, I wonder what he thought about that one. Look at 1 Kings 10, 28 and 29. Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt and linen yard. The king's merchant received the linen yard at a price. And a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so for all the kings of the Hittites, for the kings of Syria, did they bring them out by their means. Do you know what this is saying? Think of the chariot as a tank. Solomon was an arms merchant. He's buying arms and he's giving it to the enemy. He is buying chariots and he's giving them to the Hittites and to the kings of Syria. What would they think of today if, someone is selling arms to the enemy? Look, realize what this is saying here. Now look at Deuteronomy 17:17. It also says, nor shall the king multiply wives to himself so that his heart does not turn away. Well, let's look at 1 Kings 11, 1 through 4. Solomon loved many foreign women, even the daughters of Pharaoh, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, the Hittites, of the nations which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not go into them, and they shall not go into you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. And in the Hebrew, it means chased after them. It's one thing for Solomon to be here and these women coming after him, but this says he was chasing after them. He had 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines. And his wives did what? Turned away his heart. For it happened when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart, just like the Torah said, after other gods. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Not only was he not to multiply wives, he wasn't to marry foreign wives. He did both. Now let's look at Deuteronomy 17:17. What else it says? Nor shall the king greatly multiply silver and gold to himself. 1 Kings chapter 10:21. All of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon they had there at that house were all pure gold. None were even of silver, because it wasn't even counted as nothing before Solomon. Matter of fact, in 1 Kings 10:27, it says, the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars made he to be as the sycamore trees that are in the vale for abundance. If you've ever been to Israel, I tell you what, there's rocks everywhere. Now let's look back again at Deuteronomy 8. And let's look at verse 10 through 14 and verse 17 and see what else God was telling the king that was to come. And what he was speaking to the nation of Israel. He says, you're going to eat and be satisfied, and then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. But I want you to beware that you do not forget the Lord your God. Now, how many of you want to be, you see all these buildings people build because they want to be remembered? They name these buildings or bridges and everything after them. Okay? Well, God doesn't want us to forget him. And the way we remember him is by what? Keeping his commandments. That's what it says. Beware that you don't forget the Lord your God. How do you forget the Lord your God? By not keeping his commandments or his judgments or his statutes, which I'm commanding you today. And if you'll notice, it's how many of you know it's usually when we've eaten and satisfied that we forget God? It's when we're hungry and we want to be fed, we cry out to God. And then after he's fed us, it's like, okay, I don't need you anymore. You can go back and play. Okay, it's like I got God in my pocket. I'll pull you out when I need you. I don't need you anymore. I'll put you back in my pocket, but I want you to keep close to protect me. And then he says, lest when you have eaten and are full, and you have built good houses and lived in them, when your herds and your flocks have multiplied. This is so significant, this phrase here. You're going to see why here in a little bit. God is speaking about a time, this is in Deuteronomy, 500 years before Solomon, and God is speaking here about a time in the land when their silver and gold is multiplied, which speaks of Solomon's time. He talks about when your herds and your flocks multiply. He talks about when you have all these built these goodly houses. He's afraid that your heart might be lifted up and you might forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slaves. And that you might not say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. So God is concerned that people are going to think it's my power and my wealth that has gotten me these things and not God. And they're going to forget God by not keeping the commandments. Well, one of the interesting things is, I don't know if you know, there's someone else who is very wise in the Bible. And you find out who this person is in Ezekiel. Let's look what he did with his wisdom. This is chapter 28, verse 2 through 5. It says, Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre, so says the Lord Jehovah, because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am a God, I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas. Yet you are a man and not God. Though you set your heart as the heart of God's, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. Now, how many of you believe Daniel was pretty wise? Well, this guy is wiser than Daniel, it says. All secret things are not hidden from you, But what happened? It says, with your wisdom and with your understanding, you have made riches for yourself. You've worked gold and silver into your treasures. And by your great wisdom and by your trade, you have multiplied your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. You know, for myself, and again, hindsight's always 20/20, but if God were to appear to you in a dream, and remember Solomon asked for wisdom. That was a good thing, and he got wisdom. Okay? But what would you ask for? If God literally appeared to you in a dream and said he would give you whatever you asked for, what would you ask for? You know what I'd ask for? Obedience. Obedience. God, work in me to will and to do of your good pleasure, not my own. That is wisdom. I want to obey. Look what this says. Again, in 1 Kings 5:12, the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and they two made a brit together. And now let me ask you something. This is the reason why I love the Torah. It is so practical. It is so today. It is so right now. It's this circular mindset thing again. Was Solomon the king over Israel? Okay, now let me ask you something. And you'll see how this applies today. And I think I may have mentioned it earlier. The land of Israel belongs to God. And if you keep his commandments, you can stay. If not, he's going to kick you out as a tenant. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if you had a rental and that the person decided that they were going to rent out all these other rooms of the house to someone else, or tell them that they could have partial ownership? Is that going to go over with you at all? Look what Solomon did. Here he made this brit, which he was not supposed to make. Here you have the first incidents of land for peace. 1 Kings 9:11. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees with gold according to all his desire. So King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Who is Solomon to think he can give away the land that doesn't even belong to him to a foreigner? And so what is God's reaction to this land for peace idea? It says 1 Kings 9:12 that Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they didn't please him. Yeah, those are a bunch of junk. I don't even want them. Well, how often has Israel promised the Palestinians a state and they keep refusing it? It's the same thing. It's the same cycle here. Now look at Deuteronomy 17, verse 19 and 20. But I want you to see the heart of Solomon to be giving away the land of Israel. This is insane. Now Deuteronomy 17, 19 and 20. And it shall be with him, the king, the Torah, that he's supposed to write it. He's to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of the Torah, these statutes, to do them, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. Now I repeated that again because God wanted the king not to have his heart lifted up above the rest of the people, right? Now how many of you know Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? Let's take a look at a chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes and see if you think Solomon's heart was lifted up above his brothers. See if they lived in a time of the herds and the flocks multiplying and the building goodly houses and all of that. Here, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 16, Solomon says, I communed with my own heart, saying, Lo, I have become great. And I have acquired wisdom more than all they that have been before me over Jerusalem. Even Dad, basically. And my heart has seen much of wisdom and knowledge. Now look at Ecclesiastes 2, verse 4. I made my works great. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and orchards for myself. And I planted trees in them of all fruit. And I made pools of water for myself, to water the forest, shooting forth trees. And I bought slaves and slave women, and the sons of the house were mine. Also livestock, a herd, and a great flock were mine, above all that were before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered silver and gold to myself, and the treasure of kings and of the provinces, and I got men singers and women singers for myself. and the delights of the sons of men, and a wife, and I had very many wives, ha ha. So I was great, and I increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained in me. Verse 10, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my part of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all is vanity, vexation of spirit, and there is no profit under the sun. Well, do you see why? And so then what does it say? So I turned to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king when they have already done it? Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as far as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And I also knew that one event happens to all of them. So look what Solomon says. Then I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens even to me. Why was I then more wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. For there is no memory of the wise more than of the fool forever, since that which is now shall all be forgotten in the days to come. And how does the wise die above the fool? So look what Solomon says in verse 17. Therefore I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun is sad to me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. He goes on to say, yes, I hated all my labor which I had done under the sun. Why? Because I have to leave it to the man who's after me. Now, doesn't this sound like a whiny, self-centered person? Verse 19, and who knows whether he's going to be a wise or a fool, yet he shall have rule over all of my labor, and that which I have labored and acted wisely under the sun. This is vanity. Now, look how he closes in chapter 8, verse 15. This is important here. Solomon says, so I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun to do than to eat, drink, and be merry. And you're going to see something very significant about Solomon making that statement. Who was a very rich man? Solomon, right? We're going to look at the Brit Hadashah now. Let's go to Luke chapter 12, verse 15 through 21 and verse 27. Here Yeshua is speaking, and he says to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the sound of the ground of a certain rich man. I want you to know he's speaking about Solomon. This parable is all about Solomon, this story. And he says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully, and he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. This is a direct quote from Solomon. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? And that was Solomon's greatest fear. Who is going to take all of these things? Who's going to be after me? And then look what the Lord comes up and says. So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not. Yet I say unto you that Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. This is a direct reference to what we were just reading in Ecclesiastes and what Solomon had said. Now let me show you this. In 1 Kings chapter 4, this is verse 30 and 31. It says, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, even than Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. Now look at this. His fame was in all the surrounding nations. Okay, so Solomon was the one king whose fame was in all of the nations. That's when Israel, Jewry, or whatever you want to think of, was really famous throughout the world back then. Well, let's look At 1 Kings 10, 23 through 25, it says, so King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold and garments and armor and spices and horses and mules at a set rate year by year. Kind of like almost like a one world government. They're all having to bring their stuff every year. But let's look at Ezekiel 16. Here God is speaking about the days of Solomon. God is speaking about the days of Solomon. You're going to see the parallel here. God says, I decked you also with ornaments, Israel. I put bracelets upon your hands. I put a chain upon your neck. I put a jewel on your forehead, earrings in your ears, a beautiful crown upon your head. Thus you were decked with gold and silver. Your raiment was of fine linen and silk, broidered work. You did eat fine flour and honey and oil. You were exceedingly beautiful, and you did prosper into a kingdom, and your renown went forth among the heathen for your beauty. There it is. That's when they were famous around the world. For it was perfect, God says, through my comeliness, which I had put on you, saith the Lord God. But you did trust in your own beauty, and you played the harlot because of your renown, and you poured out your fornications on everyone that passed by, his it was. He says, and of your garments you did take and decked your high places with diverse colors. You played the harlot thereon. Like the like things shall not come, neither shall it be so. You've taken your fair jewels of my gold and of my silver, which I gave you, and made to yourself images of men. You committed whoredom with them. You took your broidered garments and covered them. You've set my oil and my incense before them. My meat also, which I gave you, the fine flour, the oil, the honey, wherewith I fed you. You've even set it before them for a sweet savor. And thus it was, says the Lord God. Moreover, now look at this. This is the most amazing thing. First off, how many of you from a relationship, if you gave something to your spouse that you thought was very special because you loved them, and then they took, and they ended up giving it to some other lover, how is that going to make you feel? The very thing that you loved them and you gave to them, and they turn around and go and give it to someone else. That's not going to make you too happy. Okay? Well, not only that, King Solomon had many wives, okay? And he built altars. You're going to see, I'm going to go into this verse. He allowed each one of them to build an altar to their God, all right? Who was the god of the Moabites and the Ammonites? Milcom, Chemosh. These are the ones where they would offer their children to their gods and allowed them to be sacrificed. Their firstborn, they would throw them to the god of fire and it would consume them. And look what it says. It says, moreover, you've taken your sons and your daughters whom you have borne unto me, and these have you sacrificed to them to be devoured. Is this of your whoredoms a small matter? That you have slain my children and delivered them to cause them to pass through the fire for them? Now that is what the kings of Israel were doing. Look at this. This is 1 Kings chapter 10. This is verse 13 to 14. It says, now King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all she desired. He didn't give to God what he desired, but he gave to the queen of Sheba everything she desired. Whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity. So she turned, went to her own country, she and her servants. The weight of gold that came into Solomon every year was 666 talents of gold. Now, I think that's a very telling number. Now, in Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 5, this is where it says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land, you're to make no covenant with them. Don't make any marriages, right in the middle section there underlined. Don't make any marriages with them. And then go to the last sentence here. It says, but this is how you're to deal with them. You are to destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. But what did Solomon do? Instead of destroying the altars, he built them. 1 Kings 11, 5 through 11. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. And then it says Solomon built a high place. It doesn't say his wives. It doesn't say other people. Solomon himself built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem. What is the hill on the east of Jerusalem? The Mount of Olives, for heaven's sake. And for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. You know what that means? That means some of Solomon's firstborn sons he sacrificed to these gods by his wives. Each wife would have a firstborn son as far as for her, but he allowed them all to kill his own kids. And it says, so the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing. Can you imagine if God appeared to you twice saying, don't do this, and you thumbed your nose at God and said, I'm going to go on my merry way? This is what is happening. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear this kingdom away from you, and I'm going to give it to your servant. Leviticus 18:21, he says, do not let any of your seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shall you profane the name of your God, for I am the Lord. Solomon should have known that. He should have read it. He should have written it. Every 7 years of his 40-year reign, he was supposed to be standing up and reading this to the whole... So everyone, I mean, how many of you know when people do something wrong in government, they try to hide it? They don't want to expose it. If you're doing something wrong, do you want to stand up every 7 years and read to everybody what you're doing wrong and how you're not? I mean, you're going to want to hide the Torah too. You're not going to want it to be known, because then everyone's going to hear what you're doing is wrong, and they're going to say, you're not doing that. How come this says one thing and you're doing another? Jeremiah 32, verse 35. It talks about how the kings built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech. God says, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. It happened, but it definitely wasn't anything that God had wanted. And so in 1 Kings 11, 31 through 33. Here we see God says to Jeroboam, I want you to take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I'm going to give 10 tribes to you, but he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because they've forsaken me. They've worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon. He has not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes and to keep my statutes and my judgments as did David his father. So I hear God is saying, look, he is not doing what I've told him to do at all. So I'm ripping it out of his hand. But the other, now Rehoboam was his son, and who was the name of this guy? Jeroboam. And in 1 Kings 12, 28 and 29, Jeroboam did something really stupid. It says, whereupon the king took counsel, and he made 2 idolatrous calves of gold. And he said unto them, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and he put the other one in Dan, which is way up north on the Lebanon-Syrian border. So Jeroboam, even though God had told him this is the way it's going to be, he was so consumed with maybe losing them, he was afraid if those in the northern part of Israel were to go to Jerusalem for all the feasts every year, that Rehoboam would end up pulling their heart away. So he decided he'd create his own feasts, do his own thing, and create these idols of gold. And so he ended up losing everything too. In 1 Kings 12:30, it talks about how this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even to Dan. And he made a house of high places. And look what else Jeroboam did. He made priests of the lowest of the people, who were not even of the sons of Levi. And then Jeroboam ordered a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that is in Judah. Well, what feast is he talking about? Talking about the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot, which is on the 15th of the 7th month. So just like Aaron, when he built a golden calf, declared a feast to the Lord, here you have Jeroboam trying to start a new religion, saying these are going to be the feasts of the Lord. How often does the body of Messiah take the feasts of the Lord and paganize them, saying, no, we're going to create new feasts of the Lord. Okay, this is the pattern. And so anyway, then it goes on to say that Jeroboam, he offered on the altar, and so he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So this is a whole new priesthood. I mean, you know, not to be picky, but how many priests call themselves priests and they're not even of the tribe of Levi? And then it says, and he offered on the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, and the month which he had devised out of his own heart. And he ordered a feast for the sons of Israel. In other words, I'm now the king, so I can determine when the feasts are going to be. Now, here's what's amazing, and the reason why I bring that up. Look at 1 Kings 13, 1 and 2. This is amazing. Do you know there are several people in Scripture who were prophesied they were going to be born several hundred years by name before their birth, like Cyrus? Remember King Josiah, the little boy king? Several hundred years before he was born, he was prophesied by name that he was going to come and he was going to do something. That shows you how important he was in God's plan to mention him by name several hundred years before he was born. And here in 1 Kings 13, 1 and 2, behold, there came a man of God out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel. And remember Bethel, in Genesis, that's where the ladder was, Jacob's pillow. It was supposed to be the entrance to the house of God, to heaven, okay? And that is where he put one of these golden calves. And so God says to Jeroboam, he's standing by this altar to burn incense, and he cried against the altar in the word of the Lord, and he said, O altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon you shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon you, and men's bones will be burnt upon you. Well, guess what happened 300 years later? 2 Kings 23, then he, King Josiah, removed, look what he did. He removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord. So here at the very temple, they're dedicating horses at the entrance, worshiping the sun at the temple itself. And so he has to go and destroy them. And it says he burned the chariots of the sun with fire. The altars that were on the roof, the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars which Manasseh had made in the two courts of the house of the Lord. So the king broke them down, he pulverized them there, and he threw their dust in the brook Kidron. That's the Kidron Valley. That's the valley right between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. And then what did the king do? Then the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, which were on the south of the Mount of what? He's not even calling it the Mount of Olives anymore. He calls it the Mount of Corruption because Solomon had totally corrupted it with all the pagan gods that he had built over there, which Solomon, king of Israel, had built. Now, Josiah's, you know, he's like 500 years after Solomon. So Solomon built these altars to all of his wives, and the other kings never even tore them down. They let them stand for hundreds and hundreds of years. It wasn't until Josiah that he tore down all the altars that Solomon had built. And he broke in pieces the sacred pillars and cut down the wooden images and filled their places with the bones of men. Remember that's what God told him to do? And now look at this. Here's that one prophecy being fulfilled in 2 Kings 23, verse 15 through 17. It says, moreover, the altar that was at Bethel and the high place which Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, had made, both the altar and the high place that he broke down. He broke them down. He burned the high place. He stamped it small to powder. He burned the grove. And then look at what it says. As Josiah turned himself, he spied the sepulchres that were there in the mount. And he sent and he took the bones out of the sepulchres and burned them on the altar and polluted it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God who proclaimed these words. Then he said, what is that title I see? And the many men of the city told him, why, this is the sepulchre of the man of God, which came from Judah and proclaimed that these things were going to happen that you did against the altar. Okay? So now, what happens over 100 years later? Okay, now you have the Babylonian captivity take place. They're in Babylon. 70 years have gone by, whatever. Now they're trying to rebuild the temple of the Lord. They're trying to do things correctly. Nehemiah 13 says this, verse 23 through 27. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they couldn't even speak Hebrew. But they spoke according to the language of one of the other people. So look what Nehemiah says he did. So I contended with them, I cursed them, I struck some of them, and I pulled out their hair. And I made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? This is 500 years later. Yet among the nation there was no king like him. He was beloved of his God. God did make him king over all of Israel. Nevertheless, the pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? I mean, it's like, come on, can we not? Why are we going around this mountain again? And so look at 1 Kings 9, 1 through 8. It says, it came to pass when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all Solomon's desire, which he had wanted to do, that the Lord appears to Solomon a second time, as he appeared to him at Gibeon, and the Lord said to him, look, I've heard your prayer and your supplication that you made before me, and I have consecrated this house which you have built to put my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. But now look what he says. Now, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness to do according to all I commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But then it says this, but if you or your sons at all turn from following me, you do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but you go and serve other gods and worship them, I will cut off Israel from the land which I've given them, and this house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. Now watch this phraseology. This is very important. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And it's for this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? Now, if you remember, I don't know if you know this, but God is just repeating exactly what he said in Deuteronomy that Solomon should have read. You're going to see the exact words here. Look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 15 and 37. Evidently, Solomon hadn't read it yet, so God wants to help him out and verbalize it to him. It says, but it will come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And then it says, and you shall become an astonishment and a proverb and a byword among all nations where the Lord will drive you. Right there it is. This is back in Deuteronomy. He was warning him this was going to happen. And so now he had to verbally tell him that, look, this is what's going to happen. But Solomon thumbed his nose at God. Now here's something that's amazing. Can you imagine, how many of you as brides want your bridesmaid to intentionally try to outdress you? Kill. Especially on your special day, the wedding day. Okay, I mean, come on, give me a break. Now here, they're dedicating Solomon's temple. Who is supposed to get all the glory here? God. We already saw from the prayer, Solomon was trying to draw a lot of attention to himself already. But here, this is the dedication of the temple, and God is the one that's supposed to get all the glory. I'm going to show you something you may have never seen before. In 1 Kings 8, 62 through 64, here it's happening. It says, the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifice before the Lord. And Solomon, well, think of it this way. How many of you want someone when they're going to make a donation to sound the bells, the alarm? Look at me, I am giving a check for $1 million. Here's the check, got my name on it. What do you think of those kind of people that make a big production out of their offering? Look what Solomon did. Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to the Lord, 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. Now, who's supposed to hallow something, the priest or the king? The priests are the ones that are supposed to hallow something. But look at this. It says, the same day the king hallowed the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, and there he offered his burnt offerings and meat offerings and the fat of the peace offerings, because the brazen altar that was for the Lord was too little to receive his burnt offerings and meat offerings and the fat of peace offerings. And the word too little there is katan, and it means it's not as important. So here, the very brazen altar, at the dedicatory time, Solomon offers all this stuff, and he decides to dedicate the middle of the court. It's like the women's court is where he's doing all of his offerings, it says, because the brazen altar that God wanted to have things offered on, it was too little for his great offering. When you remember that movie, How Great Is Our God, again, look at Isaiah 40, verse 15 and 16. God says, behold, the nations are a drop of a bucket. They're counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he takes up the isles as a very little thing. Lebanon isn't sufficient to burn. All the trees of Lebanon isn't sufficient for me, God says. You're talking about some little toothpicks here, guys. And then he says, nor the beasts thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. So he's speaking specifically about that time. You think offering me thousands of bulls and goats is what I'm looking for? What does he say in 1 Samuel 15:22? Samuel says, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. So what is God saying here? What does he really want? He wants our heart. He wants our obedience. And so we see obedience is better than sacrifice. Now, how many of you have heard that before? But you know the problem with most of Christianity? Then they go about and say, oh, you don't even have to obey either. Now, wait a minute. How can you say obedience is better than sacrifice, and then you say you don't even have to obey either? That is really weird to me. But look at Hosea 6:6. God says, I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. He wants us to know him, not on a head level, on a heart level. Micah 6:7. Is the Lord going to be pleased with thousands of rams or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Okay, I mean, it's just incredible the way people think. I mean, how many of you, let's think in terms of boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, whatever, if someone has really done something, if your spouse has totally wronged you, and they come up and try to give you a flower, you're going to tell them to take that flower and put it somewhere. All right? Once they show you the relationship is right, then you'll take the flowers. Not that you don't want a flower. Let's say you've let your spouse know. I mean, my wife doesn't like flowers. I mean, she's allergic to a lot of the flowers. So I don't get her flowers. Okay, I get her something else. Chocolate. No. But anyway, my point, though, is this. If I know someone wants something, and then I offend them, if I go and try to bring them something else that I know they don't want, that's not what they want. But even if I bring them something they do want, what they really want is your heart, and then they'll accept it. So it's not saying that God doesn't want sacrifice, because he commanded sacrifice. What he's saying is, I want you to obey me, and then I'll take your sacrifice. He's not saying don't bring sacrifice. Deuteronomy 17:18-20. Again, when he sits on the throne of this kingdom, he's to write a copy of this law in a book. So now, going back to Matthew 5:18, remember I had mentioned to you how the Lord said, not till one heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or one tittle will in no wise pass from the Torah. Do you know the sages of that time immediately thought of Solomon? Most Christians don't realize that. But when Yeshua said that, they immediately thought of Solomon. Look at Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. Again, here's where it says he's not to multiply wives, that his heart turn not away. Do you know what the sages say about that? What they say is this. On your notes there, I have the Hebrew word yerbeh, which is he shall not multiply. Okay? The sages midrashically say that when Solomon was writing that, and the Levites and the priests were watching over to make sure he did it correctly, that he dropped the letter yod. He left that out. And by leaving the yod off, it says rabah, which means he did not multiply. And so what Solomon did, he changed the tense of the verb. Now, instead of being an imperative, he shall not, it implies that his past multiplication of wives would not have the effect of leading his heart astray. So by changing the tense, it no longer is an imperative not to multiply wives, but it becomes a statement implying that his past multiplication of wives will not have the effect of leading his heart astray. And the yod is the jot, or the smallest letter. And here the sages were saying that he dropped the smallest letter from the law. Okay? And so what Solomon is saying, I am so wise, I can multiply my wise, and it won't have the effect on me to lead my heart astray because I'm so wise. In a famous midrash, this is from Exodus Rabbah 6:1, Solomon arose and studied the reason God gave the commandment, saying, why did God command he shall not multiply wise for himself? Was it not just to keep his heart from turning away? Well, I will multiply my wise, and I will allow my heart to turn away. So in all of his great wisdom, Solomon supposed he understood the reasoning behind the commandment, thinking if I keep my heart from going astray, then I am free to multiply wise all I want. Because he understood the principle of the law, he did not need to obey the literal meaning of it. The rationale is, well, I understand what the Torah really meant by such and such a commandment, therefore I don't need to actually keep the commandment. Some of you are getting what I just said. And some of this may be going over someone's head. But all too often within Christianity, we say, oh, I understand the meaning of that commandment, therefore I don't have to do it. I'm just going to do this, and then I won't do that. It won't affect me. The midrash continues, okay? And this is just midrashing. It says, at that time, the little letter yod of the word yerbeh went up to heaven and prostrated itself before God and said, Master of the universe, didn't you say that no letter should ever be abolished from the Torah? See, this was written thousands of years ago. This is before Christ. And so when he talked about that, not one jot or tittle will pass away, they were thinking about this verse. They were thinking about Solomon. And listen what it says. It says, behold, he says, behold, Solomon has now arisen and abolished a letter, and who knows, today he's abolished one letter. Tomorrow he will abolish another until the whole Torah will be nullified. And God replied, Solomon and 1,000 like him will pass away, but the smallest tittle will not be erased from you. So now you know where that verse came from. Now it refers right back to Solomon. The Midrash goes on continuing this verse. In 1 Kings 11:4, it came to pass Solomon was old, that his wife turned away his heart after other gods. The sages say it would have been better for Solomon to clean sewers than to have this verse eternally written of him. In Christian theology, we have now erased whole sentences and chapters of the Torah because we've assumed ourselves to be wiser than the Torah. We have taken our cues from King Solomon rather than King Yeshua, and if that is true, it would be better if we clean sewers rather than play at theology. So, with that in mind, I hope I've changed a little bit of your thoughts on who Solomon is, who Solomon was, and that is what you need to know before you start reading the Song of Solomon. Now, I have a little bit of time left. I wasn't sure, so I'm going to jump into the Song of Solomon a little bit here. Now, this isn't on your notes. If you brought your Bible, open up to the Song of Solomon. And because of time's sake, and I'm just going to teach from my head here because I don't have any notes, but and I don't have any of the CDs or the notes left. But the vast majority of notes, I mean, this is just the introduction that I just gave. But the CDs, I go through every chapter, every verse of all this, and you're going to look at this book differently than you have ever seen it before. Now, we're out, but if you want to order the CDs, then you can check the list and we'll mail them to you at the same price. Now, here's some things I just want to highlight. First off, I want you to notice in Song of Solomon 1. Let's go to verse 4. It says, there's some little things I want to highlight. I mean, here's someone, this is the Shulamite speaking, and she's really pretty insecure. She says, draw me and we will run after you. Notice it's draw me, but we will run. It's not I will run. So she's saying, oh, pick me, oh, pick me. And then she's probably thinking, oh, maybe he won't. So, okay, I'll just come along with everybody else. And then she says this, the king has brought me into his chambers. Okay, she knows who the king is. It's King Solomon. She's in his chambers. But then she says, we will be glad to rejoice in you. It doesn't say in him. So she's speaking out to the shepherd, but we're going to be glad and rejoice in you. We're going to remember your love more than wine. The upright love you. And then in verse 6, let's jump there for a minute. She says, look not upon me because I am black, because the sun has looked upon me. Remember, they worshiped the sun. Okay, they were sun worshipers. And then she says, my mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. So it's almost like she was minding a lot of other business, but not her own. She didn't even take care of her own vineyard. But now look at verse 7. You would think if you love someone, how many of you would want someone to come up to you and say they loved you, and they didn't know your name, they didn't know where you worked, what you did? I mean, you kind of question their love. Well, she is saying this to the shepherd now in verse 7. Tell me, O thou whom my soul loves, where you feed and where you make your flock to rest at noon. Okay, well, she knows that's not King Solomon. She knows where he is. He's in the chambers. But here now she's speaking to the shepherd whom she really loves, and she wants to know where you feed and where you make your flock to rest at noon. Well, doesn't that sound just like the body of Messiah, the bride? She just wants to know when it's lunch. I don't want to go work the harvest. You tell me when you're taking a break, and then I'll come take a break with you. I just want to eat and rest. And then she has the gall to say this, for why should I be as one that turns aside by the flocks of your companions? If you don't pick me, I just may go somewhere else. Very interesting. And so the daughters of Jerusalem in verse 8 come up to her and they say, well, if you don't know, O fairest among women, why don't you follow the footsteps of the flock? Why don't you start feeding your kids beside the shepherd's tents? Maybe you'll figure out where he is. Remember, the children of this world are wiser than the children of light. And then in verse 9, he compares her. He says, I've compared you, O my love. So you know he's speaking here. And he goes into proclaiming what she is to him. And then what I want you to notice is down in verse 15. He says, behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair, and you have dove's eyes. So here he is. He's the man looking at her. And where's he looking at? He's looking in her eyes. That's what he's consumed with her as a person. He's looking into her eyes. What is she looking at? She goes, verse 16, behold, you're fair, my beloved. Yeah, pleasant. Hey, look, our bed is green. The beams of our house are cedar. The rafters are of fir. What is she looking at? The possessions that she's going to get in this marriage. This is a good deal. He's consumed with her. She's consumed with the possessions. She's not looking in his eyes. She's looking all around everything she's going to get. Okay, in chapter 2, a lot of people misinterpret this verse, but here it says, I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. Okay, well, that is not referring to him, it's referring to her. And in verse 2, he responds to her and says, yeah, well, as a lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. In other words, the thorns speak of the nations. Okay, and here Israel is like a lily among thorns. Now, how many of you know thorns is a good thing, or it could be a bad thing? Okay, the thorns, the nations were to be as thorns to protect Israel. Okay? Now, verse 6, this is very important. First off, do you remember in the introduction, who keeps falling asleep? She does. Now look at verse 6. It says, his left hand is under my head, and his right hand does embrace me. So if his left hand is under her head, who is laying down? She is. Okay, now verse 7, remember, if it's my love, it's him talking about her. And in verse 7, he says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes, by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up nor awake my love. It's supposed to be till she please. In most of your translation, it says he please, but that is inaccurate. Some of them say it pleases, but it's my love till she please. In other words, I'm going to let her sleep until she wants to, and then she can wake up. You'll see, if you look in your concordance, you're going to see it's feminine. It's supposed to be she's the one that fell asleep. And you're going to see this plainly when you look at the next verses. Here in verse 8, she hears the voice. She says, the voice of my beloved. So that's her speaking, saying she hears his voice. She says, he's coming, leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills. My beloved is like a roe or a young hart. He's standing behind our wall. He looks forth at the window, showing himself through the lattice. And then look at what she says. My beloved spoke and said to me, what? Get up. So who was the one laying down? She was. Okay? And look at what he says. Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away, for lo, the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. In other words, she didn't sleep one night. She went into hibernation. She slept all winter. And he says, guess what? I think you slept long enough. And the winter is when the heavy rains are. And the rains speak of the blessings of God. He's saying you've missed out on all of the blessings by sleeping all winter long. So he says, rise up, my love, my fair one, come away. Lo, the winter is past. The rain, it's over. It's gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing of the birds has come. The voice of the turtle is heard in our land. Now, if you remember from Isaiah 5 and other chapters, God planted a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and that vineyard refers to who? Israel. Israel's known as the fig tree. And here it says, the fig tree puts forth her green figs, or her ripe figs. The vine with tender grapes give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. In other words, we need to work the harvest here. And then in verse 15, he says, take us the foxes. The little foxes that spoil the vine, for our vine has tender grapes. Now, this is very important. Let me give you a verse here. Now, here, when it says, let us take the foxes, because the foxes are trying to spoil the vine. Now, I told you the vine or the fig tree, the figs refer to who? So who are the foxes? What are the foxes? Write down this verse. In Ezekiel 13:4, he says, O Israel, your prophets are the foxes in the desert. The prophets are the foxes. So in the Song of Solomon, when he says the foxes are trying to spoil the vine, he's saying the prophets are the ones who are destroying you. I want you to look at this, and I find the best way to understand Scripture is to let Scripture interpret itself. Amen. Instead of you trying to put in your own opinion. And so right here, he says, we need to take the foxes, the little foxes that are spoiling the vine, for our vines are tender. Don't allow these false prophets to come in and destroy you. And then look at what she says. This is incredible. Now, how many of you, if let's say you're with your boss, or whatever, or someone who's in a higher authority, and that person in higher authority is taking you someplace, and someone comes up, and is talking to you about the situation, do you say, I'm with him or he's with me? I'm with him, right? Look what she says in verse 16. My beloved is mine, and I am his. In other words, he belongs to me first, and then I belong to him. I tell him what to do, and then he can tell me what to do. Okay, my beloved is mine. Oh, and I'm his too. You're going to find this saying gets reversed. Later it goes on to say, I am my beloved's and he is mine. And then it changes again. I am my beloved's and his desire is toward me. Okay, so you're going to see a growth in this person's during this whole thing. But remember the first chapter, she was saying, tell me where you feed your flock. Well, now she takes pride in the fact that she knows a little bit where he feeds. But look at what she says. After this, she says, my beloved is mine, I'm his. Oh, he feeds among the lilies, so I know a little bit about him, so that must make everything okay. But then she has the gall to say this in verse 17. She says, until the day break and the shadows flee away, why don't you go away, my beloved, and be like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Biltz. And Biltz in Hebrew means separation. In other words, like the Cascades. In other words, she's here, he's wooing her, saying, arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. And she says to him, go take a hike. I'm sitting here in this beautiful house. I don't want to go work. You go take a hike. Now, if you remember, in the other chapter, she said, our bed is green. Remember? Look at chapter 3, verse 1. by night on my bed. All of a sudden, it's no longer our bed. Now it's my bed. It's almost like she kicked him out. She says, on my bed I sought him, whom my soul loves. Wasn't that amazing? And then how often we seek him. At night, in our bed, last thing we do, let's throw up a few prayers to God before I go to sleep. So by night, on my bed, I sought him. In other words, she thought, man, I am so great, I can't imagine him not wanting to be with me. Where is he? And here he had come to her saying, why don't you come with me and go work the harvest? And now she could have been with him, but instead she says, I sought him, but I found him not. How often does the Bible say, you will find me when you search for me with what? All your heart. She wasn't even searching for him until this point. And since he says, I will get up now, and I will go about the city in the streets, and in the broad ways I will seek him. What do we know? Broad is the way of destruction. And so here she is at night, in the dark, in the broad way, seeking him who her soul loves. She says, I sought him, but I found him not. And then there's these watchmen that go about the city. They found me, to whom I said, have you seen him whom my soul loves? The minute she confessed him to others, she finds him. Verse 4, it wasn't but a little while I passed from them, but I found him whom my soul loves. I held him, I'm not going to let him go. I'm going to bring you to mother's house. That's what he says. And so, and then in verse 5, it says, again, he says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes, by the hinds of the field, you stir not up, nor wake my love till she pleases. So here she is, falling asleep again. And then in verse 6 it says, who is this that's coming out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the powders of the merchant? Behold, his bed, which is Solomon. That's what Solomon was all about. Okay? 60 valiant men are about it of the vine of Israel. They all are holding swords, being expert in war. Every man hath a sword upon his thigh because of fear in the night. Here Solomon doesn't even have any care or concern about his soldiers. Here he is. He's a man of the night. Remember, we're to be men of the day, children of the day, not of the night. Here he is, the man of the night. Everyone's moving in fear. They all got their swords. And then it talks about his chariot. And then look at verse 10. This is very telling. Solomon made the pillars of silver, the bottom of gold, the covering it of purple, the midst thereof being paved with love for who? The daughters of Jerusalem, not for her. And so then she says back to the daughters of Jerusalem, you go forth, O you daughters of Zion. You behold King Solomon with the crown wherewith his mother crowned him in the day of his espousals, in the day of the gladness of his heart. He says, you go on. I'm sticking with the shepherd. Okay, let's look at chapter 4. Okay. Let's go down to verse 12 of chapter 4. Now, in the CDs, I go verse by verse, and I expound on it, and it goes for a long time. But I want you to notice here in verse 12, he says to her, a garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. In other words, you're a pool, and you're not going anywhere. What happens if you have something and there's no outlet? And so he says, you're a fountain sealed. And so in verse 16, listen to what she says. She says, awake, O north wind, and come thou south, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved, she goes, come into his garden. All of a sudden she realized I said my garden, I mean his garden. So then she changes her mind and says, let him come into his garden. Now let's look at chapter 5. He responds back to her, and he goes, yes, dear, I am coming to my garden. You're my sister. You're my spouse. I've gathered my myrrh with my spice. I've eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I've drunk my wine with my milk. And then it's almost like he's quoting Isaiah. O friends, drink, yea, drink abundantly, O beloved, or eat everybody. Let everybody eat. Come and eat and drink. And then what do we find here? In verse 2, how does it begin? There she is. She's back asleep again. But what's very amazing is in English we have the word sleep, But the Hebrew word here, the word for sleep, is not what we might think of. How many of you know sometimes you put the dog to sleep, and that's a different sleep? The Hebrew word for this sleep is the same Hebrew word in Daniel about those who sleep in the dust of the earth. So she is at the point of death. But it says, but my heart is still ticking. Okay? I mean, she is just about at the point of death, but her heart's ticking. And then she hears the voice of her beloved that knocketh. Now, when we hear knock, we think rap. But that's not the Hebrew word here. The word means to beat severely, to be in overdrive. He is beating on the door. She's inside the house. He's outside. And now it's almost like he's doing CPR, trying to get the heart going again. Okay? He's outside. She's inside. He's beating on the door, and he wants in. And listen to what it says. She says, it's the voice of my beloved that knocketh, saying, open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. My head is filled with dew, my locks with the drops of the night. In other words, it is raining outside. But again, he doesn't want in. He wants her to come out and enjoy the rain, because that speaks of the blessings. And the dew speaks of the resurrection of the dead in Judaism. And I go through that and I lay that out. And look at what she says in verse 3. But I've taken off my coat. You want me to put it back on? I've washed my feet. You want me to get them dirty? And then she says, well, my beloved put in his hand by the hole of the door. Oh, my bowels are moved for him. Oh, she claimed to love him. She claimed to have all this, these bowels of love. But she doesn't want to do nothing. It's all talk. And so finally she says, I rose up to open to my beloved, and my hands dropped with myrrh, my fingers with sweet-smelling myrrh. In other words, you wait, dear, while I get all ready for you. And then it says, upon the handles of the lock. That's why he couldn't get in. She not only had the door shut, it was locked and barred. Not only would she not go out and work the harvest, she wasn't going to let anyone even come in to talk to them about it. Here, instead of anxiously awaiting his second coming, instead of looking out the window, instead of being in the field working with him, she's in the house. She's not only not looking out the window anticipating his return, she's sleeping and has the door locked and barred so no one can come in and hear the good news. And so it says that when I opened to my beloved had withdrawn himself. He was gone. My soul failed when he spake. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave no answer. And so this time it says the watchmen that went about the city, they found me and they smote me. They wounded me. The keepers of the walls took away my veil from me. The purpose of the veil in those days was meant you were committed to someone. You were in a relationship. And the watchmen are ripping your veil off. You're not committed to him. You're not committed to anybody. And then she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him that I'm sick of love. And then look what the daughters of Jerusalem say to her. Well, what's your beloved more than any other beloved? What's the big deal about him? O fairest among women, why is your beloved any more than any beloved that you so charge us? So here she goes into this in-depth, oh, my beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000. So again, now she's confessing him before others, but now she's getting a whole lot more detailed. And then in verse 16, she says, his mouth is most sweet. He's altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O you daughters of Jerusalem. So what do we find in chapter 6? Now, after this wonderful testimony of her love, when she actually is speaking to others about him, they go, oh my gosh, where's he gone, O fairest among women? Where's your beloved? Turn aside that we may seek him with you. And that's what we want. We want people to seek the Messiah with us. But how will they know unless they have heard? How will they hear unless someone is out of the house, not just in the four walls, being fed and not doing the work? And this time she's wised up. In verse 2, she says, my beloved has gone down into his garden, to the bed of spices, to feed in the gardens and to gather lilies, other people. And then she says, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. He feeds among the lilies. Do you see how she's turned it around there, that phrase? And then all of a sudden he shows up and he speaks to her. You are beautiful, oh my love. Turn away your eyes from me. They've overcome me. Isn't he gracious? Isn't he even toward our sin, our rebellion? And then, so let's go to the next chapter, 7. Remember how beautiful are the feet of those that spread good news? Chapter 7, verse 1, how beautiful are your feet with shoes, O prince's daughter. She's finally spreading the good news. She's finally taking it out. Look at verse 10, 7:10. She says, I am my beloved's and his desire is toward me. She makes no claim on his life at all anymore. And then look what she finally says in verse 11. She says to him, come, my beloved, let us go into the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Finally, she gets the picture. The end is better than the beginning. Here she's finally getting it, and now she's saying, I want to work the field. I want to get out. And she says, verse 12, let's get up early. Now instead of always falling asleep, she wants to get up early, and let's go to the vineyards. Let's see if the vine is flourishing, whether the tender grape appear, the pomegranates bud forth, and there will I give you my love. In other words, rather than just being enclosed in these four walls of Bless Me Club, I'm going to give you my loves out in the field where I'm trying to win people back to you and get people into a relationship with you. And then in chapter 8, look at verse 3. His left hand is under my head, his right hand embraced me. Verse 4, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you stir not up nor wake my love till she please. And then what do we find in verse 5? Who was this coming up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved? In other words, she's not in the house anymore. Now she's been out working with him. Now she's falling asleep in his arms, not on the bed in the house, and he's gone. And remember before it was, who was this coming up out of the wilderness? And who was it? Solomon with his harem. But this time it's her with him. Let's see. And then let's go down to verse 11 of chapter 8. Solomon had a vineyard in Baal-Hamon. Baal, the other god, so to speak. And he let out his vineyard to the keepers. Every one of the fruit thereof was to bring 1,000 pieces of silver. Same thing. This is what the king wants. He's going to make you do his stuff. But then in verse 12, she says, my vineyard, which is mine, is before me. And then she says, you, O Solomon, must have 1,000, and those that keep the fruit thereof 200. But then she says, you that dwell in the gardens, which is the Messiah, the bridegroom. She says, the companions hearken to your voice. Cause me to hear it. And then she says, make haste, my beloved. Be like a roe or a young hart upon the mountain of spices, not the mountains of Bether. And when you think of the mountain of spices, I can't help but think of Mount Moriah, okay, where he died. But anyway, that is just a real quick summary of the Song of Solomon from a perspective that you may not have heard it before. I don't know. But I look at this from a totally different viewpoint than most people do. And I think when you understand Solomon, and then you begin to read this book, and you look at these things from this perspective, it's going to totally change your understanding. Any questions on any of this? All right. Well, again, we don't have any more of the CDs left, but if you want some, we can still get them mailed out to you today. But I want to thank you, and tonight is going to be really different. It's going to be a shocker. I don't know if this last one was a shocker to you. Does it change your view of Solomon at all? Okay. Well, tonight, I'm going to radically change your views on something called replacement theology. And we're going to look at some of the New Testament scriptures, but I'm going to give you a different interpretation of some of these verses that you may not have understood before. But thank you all for coming.
Adonai v'yishmarech